Amara's hands trembled as she stared at the two pink lines on the pregnancy test. At 19, she had never even been kissed properly, let alone this. The cramped bathroom of her family's one-room apartment in Lagos suddenly felt suffocating, the walls closing in as her entire world crumbled in an instant. How could this happen to someone who had never been with a man? If you're new here and want to discover incredible stories that will leave you speechless, please hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. We're racing to 100,000 subscribers, and your support means everything. 3 months earlier, Amara had been desperate. Her mother lay dying in the government hospital, the bills piling up like autumn leaves, while her father had abandoned them years ago for a younger woman in Abuja. The doctors needed 5 million naira immediately, or they would discharge her mother to die at home. That's when her best friend Kemi mentioned the medical trial. "It's completely safe," she had insisted, scrolling through her phone. "They're testing new fertility treatments. You just go in once a week for injections. They monitor your health and you get paid 500,000 naira. No side effects, no risks." Amara had hesitated. She was studying pre-med at the University of Lagos, top of her class despite working 3 part-time jobs. She knew enough about medicine to be cautious. But watching her mother's labored breathing that night, seeing the hope fade from her eyes with each passing day, Amara made a decision that would change everything. The clinic was located in Victoria Island, a gleaming testament to Nigeria's oil wealth. Dr. Adeleke, a distinguished man in his 50s, explained the procedure with clinical precision. "We're developing revolutionary fertility treatments for couples struggling to conceive. The injections contain synthetic hormones and enhanced genetic material, completely harmless to someone young and healthy like yourself." What Dr. Adeleke didn't mention was that the clinic was owned by Kehinde Ogbonna, Nigeria's youngest billionaire at 32. Kehinde had built his empire through tech innovations and strategic investments, but his latest venture was far more personal, haunted by a rare genetic condition that left him unable to father children naturally. He had poured his fortune into developing experimental fertility treatments. The twist? The genetic material in Amara's injections wasn't synthetic at all. For 8 weeks, Amara visited the clinic religiously. The money helped save her mother's life. The surgery was successful, and slowly, painfully, her mother began to recover. Amara threw herself into her studies with renewed vigor, determined to become a doctor herself and prevent other families from suffering as hers had. But then came the nausea, the missed periods, the exhaustion that no amount of sleep could cure. Standing in that bathroom, pregnancy test in hand, Amara's mind raced through the impossibilities. She was a virgin. She had been so careful, so focused on her studies and her mother's recovery. The only medical procedure she'd undergone were those clinic injections, but that was impossible. "Wasn't it?" Her phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. "We need to talk. Meet me at the Radisson Blu Hotel lobby, Victoria Island. 6 p.m. K.O. Amara's blood ran cold. K.O. Kehinde Ogbonna. But how did he have her number? Why was he contacting her? A creeping dread began to settle in her stomach alongside the morning sickness. At the hotel, she spotted him immediately. Kehinde Ogbonna's picture was in every business magazine, his success story legendary. Son of a market trader who built a tech empire worth over 15 billion naira. But seeing him in person, Amara was struck by how young he looked, how tired his eyes seemed despite his confident posture. "Miss Amara," he said, standing as she approached, "thank you for coming. Please sit." "How do you know who I am?" she whispered, her voice barely audible above the hotel's soft jazz music. Kehinde leaned forward, his expression serious. "Because what happened to you is my fault, and I'm going to make it right." The story he told her was like something from a nightmare. The fertility clinic, his desperate attempts to father a child, the experimental procedures that bypassed traditional conception methods. "The injections you received weren't just hormones," he explained, his voice heavy with guilt. "They contained my genetic material, enhanced and modified to achieve pregnancy without traditional intercourse. I never intended for this to happen to someone who wasn't a willing participant in the program." Amara felt the world spin around her. "You're telling me that I'm pregnant with your child? Without my consent? Without even knowing? The clinic was supposed to only work with couples who understood the full procedure." Kehinde said quickly. Dr. Adeleke assured me all participants were informed. When I discovered what he had done, how he had recruited young women under false pretenses to test the treatment, I shut down the entire program immediately. But it was too late. The betrayal cut deeper than any physical pain Amara had ever experienced. She had trusted the medical system, trusted that her body was safe, trusted that her choices were her own. How many others? She whispered. 7 women total. You're the only one who... The only pregnancy that was successful. Amara stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the marble floor. She stumbled toward the hotel bathroom, barely making it before she vomited violently, her body rejecting not just food, but the entire reality of her situation. When she emerged, Kehinde was waiting outside, his face etched with concern and guilt. I need time to think, she managed. Amara, wait. Kehinde's voice was desperate now. I know this is overwhelming, but I want to support you. Whatever you decide, whether you want to continue the pregnancy or not, I'll cover all medical expenses, provide financial security, ensure you can finish your education. She turned back to him, tears streaming down her face. You think money fixes this? You think paying for it makes it okay that my body was violated without my knowledge, that my entire future has been decided by your experiment? The raw pain in her voice seemed to shatter something in Kehinde's composed exterior. No, he said quietly. No, I don't think money fixes this. I think I've made the worst mistake of my life, and I have to live with the fact that I've hurt innocent people in my desperation to have a family. That night, Amara couldn't sleep. She paced their tiny apartment, her mother watching with growing concern as her daughter spiraled into a panic that threatened to consume everything she had worked for. By dawn, she had made a decision that surprised even herself. She was going to fight back. Amara spent the next week researching everything she could about Kehinde Ogbonna, his business empire, and the fertility clinic. What she discovered made her blood boil. The clinic had been operating under a veil of secrecy, targeting young women from low-income families with promises of easy money and no risks. Dr. Adeleke had been systematically lying to vulnerable women, using their desperation to further an illegal medical experiment. But more shocking was what she learned about the other 6 women. 3 had miscarried within the first trimester, dealing with both physical trauma and the psychological devastation of losing pregnancies they never consented to. 2 others had been so traumatized they had attempted suicide. 1 had disappeared entirely, her family claiming she had gone to stay with relatives in the village, but Amara suspected something darker. Armed with this information, she called Kehinde again. But this time, she wasn't the confused, frightened girl from the hotel. I want to meet the other women, she said without preamble when he answered. Amara, I don't think that's wise. They've been through exactly what I'm going through. And if you want any chance of me not going to the press with this story, you'll arrange the meeting. The silence on the other end stretched so long, she thought he had hung up. Finally, his voice came through, quiet and resigned. I'll make the arrangements. The meeting took place in a private room at a discreet hotel in Abuja. Amara had insisted on neutral ground, away from Lagos, where Kehinde's influence ran deepest. As she walked into that room and saw 5 other young women, ranging in age from 18 to 24, she felt her heart break all over again. Folake, a 22-year-old nursing student, had lost her pregnancy at 11 weeks and suffered severe complications that left her hospitalized for 2 weeks. Bukola, barely 18, had been so traumatized by the experience that she had dropped out of secondary school and hadn't spoken to her family in months. Yemi, a 24-year-old teacher, had attempted suicide twice after learning the truth about her pregnancy, but it was Aduni's story that shattered Amara completely. The 20-year-old had carried her pregnancy to term, giving birth to a son she named Emeka. But the experimental nature of the procedure had caused complications. The baby was born with severe developmental delays and would require lifelong care. Aduni sat clutching a photo of her son, tears streaming down her face as she spoke. He's beautiful, she whispered, but he'll never have a normal life, and I can't afford his medical care. The treatments he needs cost more than my entire family makes in a year. Kehinde, who had been silent throughout the testimonies, finally spoke. His voice was barely above a whisper. I'll cover all medical expenses for Emeka, for all of you. Whatever you need, Amika. For all of you. Whatever you need. Money doesn't fix this, Folaki said, her voice sharp with anger. Money doesn't give me back my health. Money doesn't erase the nightmares or make me trust doctors again. You're right, Kahinda replied. It doesn't. But it's all I can offer, and it's not enough. Amara looked around the room at these broken women, at their stories of trauma and betrayal, and felt something crystallize inside her. This wasn't just about her anymore. This wasn't just about one accidental pregnancy, or one billionaire's guilt. This was about justice. We're going to destroy him, Amara announced to the group. Not just financially, completely. We're going to make sure he never has the power to hurt anyone again. Yemi looked up sharply. How? He has unlimited resources, political connections, the best lawyers money can buy. Because we have something he doesn't, Amara replied, her voice growing stronger. We have the truth. And we have each other. Over the next month, the 7 women, including Hawa, the 6th woman who had finally been located living with relatives in Kano, formed an unlikely alliance. Amara used her medical knowledge to document the physical and psychological trauma each woman had suffered. Folake, despite her own trauma, used her nursing background to help gather medical evidence. Yemi leveraged her teaching skills to research legal precedents and patient rights violations. They called themselves the Genesis, 7 women whose lives had been forever, altered by one man's desperate desire to create life. Their first move was strategic. Instead of going directly to the press, they filed a joint lawsuit against both Kahinda and Dr. Adeleke, seeking not just financial compensation, but criminal charges for medical assault, fraud and violation of informed consent. The case was assigned to Justice Adebayo Ogundimu, a respected judge known for his strict interpretation of medical ethics laws. Kahindi's legal team was formidable, a squad of Nigeria's most expensive lawyers, led by barrister Emeka Nwosu, a man who had never lost a high-profile case. They immediately moved to have the case dismissed, arguing that the women had signed consent forms and that any complications were the result of experimental medicine, not criminal intent. But they hadn't counted on Amara's methodical approach. She had spent weeks analyzing every document from the clinic, every consent form, every medical record. What she discovered was damning. The consent forms were deliberately vague, written in complex medical terminology that obscured the true nature of the procedures. None of the women had been told they were receiving actual genetic material. None had been informed of the experimental nature of the treatment. None had been warned of potential pregnancy. The breakthrough came when Bukola, the youngest of the group, remembered something crucial. During her final visit to the clinic, she had overheard Dr. Adeleke on a phone call, speaking in Yoruba to someone he called Oga. She hadn't understood all the medical terms, but she clearly remembered him saying, "The pregnancy rates are exceeding expectations. The billionaire will be pleased." This phone call had taken place 2 weeks before any of the women had been informed of their pregnancies. Armed with this evidence, the Genesis 7's lawyer, barrister Chiamaka Okoro, a brilliant young woman who had taken the case pro bono, filed additional charges of conspiracy and premeditated medical fraud. The case began to attract national attention, with news outlets picking up the story of 7 young women taking on one of Nigeria's most powerful men. But Kahindi wasn't going down without a fight. Within days of the story breaking nationally, strange things began happening to the Genesis 7. Folake was suddenly expelled from nursing school for academic misconduct that her professors swore she had never committed. Yemi was fired from her teaching position after anonymous complaints about her moral character. Bukola's family received threatening phone calls warning them to control their daughter. Most devastating was what happened to Aduni. Child Protective Services suddenly appeared at her home, claiming they had received reports of neglect regarding her son Emeka's care. Despite her meticulous attention to his medical needs, they threatened to remove him from her custody unless she could prove adequate financial resources for his care. The message was clear: drop the lawsuit or face complete destruction. But instead of breaking their resolve, the attacks only strengthened it. Media outlets began investigating the suspicious timing of these events, and public opinion started shifting in favor of the Genesis 7. Women's rights organizations rallied behind them. Medical ethics boards launched their own investigations into the fertility clinic. The turning point came during Kahinde's deposition. Barrister Okoro was relentless in her questioning, forcing him to confront the reality of what his desperation had caused. For hours, she walked him through each woman's story, each moment of trauma, each life forever altered by his choices. "Mr. Ogbonna," she said, her voice cutting through the sterile conference room, "when you approved Dr. Adelek's experimental program, did you personally review the consent forms given to participants?" "My legal team reviewed all documentation," Kahinde replied carefully. "That's not what I asked. Did you personally read the forms that these young women signed?" A long pause. "No. So you trusted Dr. Adelek to obtain proper informed consent while never verifying that he had done so?" "Yes." "And when you learned that 7 young women had been impregnated without their knowledge or true consent, your first concern was protecting your reputation and business interests, wasn't it?" Kahinde's lawyer objected, but the damage was done. The deposition footage obtained by investigative journalists showed a powerful man who had prioritized his desires over the basic human rights of vulnerable women. But the most explosive revelation came from an unexpected source, Dr. Adeleke. Facing mounting criminal charges and realizing that Kahinde's legal team was prepared to throw him under the bus, decided to save himself. In a shocking press conference, he revealed that the experimental fertility program had been far more extensive than anyone had realized. The Genesis 7 weren't the only victims. Over the past 3 years, Dr. Adelek had been running similar programs across West Africa, targeting young women in Ghana, Benin, and Ivory Coast. In total, over 50 women had been subjected to experimental procedures without proper consent. Many had suffered miscarriages, medical complications, or psychological trauma. Some had died. But the most damning revelation was about Kahinde's level of involvement. Contrary to his claims of being deceived by Dr. Adeleke, phone records and email exchanges showed that he had been intimately involved in every aspect of the program. He had personally approved the target demographics, young, financially desperate women from low-income families. He had reviewed progress reports detailing pregnancy rates and complications. He had even suggested expanding the program to additional countries. The evidence painted a picture not of a desperate man deceived by an unscrupulous doctor, but of a calculating billionaire who had systematically exploited vulnerable women to achieve his personal goals. Amara watched the press conference from her family's apartment, her mother's hand gripping hers tightly as the full scope of the betrayal became clear. The man who had sat across from her in that hotel, speaking of guilt and making amends, had been lying about everything. "My daughter," her mother said softly, "now you know who you're really fighting." The trial began 6 months later, dubbed by media as the trial of the century. The courtroom in Lagos was packed daily with journalists, women's rights activists, medical professionals, and curious onlookers. Outside, protesters held signs reading, "Justice for the Genesis 7 and medical consent matters." Kahinde arrived each day in bulletproof vehicles, surrounded by security guards, his face a mask of composure that never slipped. But Amara could see the toll the trial was taking. He had lost significant weight. His usually immaculate appearance showed signs of strain, and his business empire was crumbling as investors fled and contracts were cancelled. The prosecution's case was methodical and devastating. Barrister Okoro presented evidence of systematic deception, medical fraud, and conspiracy to commit assault. Expert witnesses testified about the severe ethical violations involved in the experimental procedures. International medical organizations filed amicus briefs supporting the prosecution. But it was the testimony of the Genesis 7 themselves that truly captured public attention. Folake spoke about the ongoing medical complications that had ended her nursing career and left her unable to have children naturally. Bukola, now 19, described the nightmares and panic attacks that still plagued her daily. Yemi testified about her suicide attempts and the ongoing psychological therapy she needed. Hawa, speaking publicly for the first time, revealed that she had been only 17 when she received the experimental treatments, technically a minor, who could not legally consent to experimental medical procedures under any circumstances. But it was Aduni's testimony that broke the courtroom's composure entirely. Holding a current photo of her son Emeka, Now 18 months old, she described his daily struggles with developmental delays caused by the experimental procedures. "He'll never run and play like other children," she said, her voice steady despite the tears. "He'll need constant medical care for the rest of his life. And every day when I look at his sweet face, I remember that his suffering exists because one man thought his desire for a child was more important than my right to choose." The defense's strategy was to paint Kahinda as a victim of Dr. Adelike's deception, a grieving man whose desperate desire for family had been exploited by an unscrupulous doctor. They brought in character witnesses, presented evidence of his philanthropic work, and emphasized his own medical condition that prevented natural conception. But their case fell apart during cross-examination when phone recordings emerged of Kahinde personally discussing the success rates of targeting financially motivated young women and expressing satisfaction with the efficiency of the African expansion. The prosecution's closing argument was delivered by Barrister Okoro with a passion that left no one unmoved. "Members of the jury," she said, her voice ringing through the packed courtroom, "this case is about more than 7 women who were wronged. This is about the fundamental principle that no person, no matter how wealthy, how powerful, how desperate, has the right to use another human being's body for their own purposes without true, informed consent." The defendant wants you to believe he is a victim of deception, but the evidence shows he was the architect of a systematic program designed to exploit vulnerable women across multiple countries. He personally approved targeting criteria. He celebrated successful pregnancies. He expanded operations knowing that women were being deceived. These 7 brave women sitting behind me represent not just their own trauma, but the trauma of dozens of other women across West Africa who trusted medical professionals and instead became unwilling participants in illegal experimentation. Justice demands accountability. Justice demands that we send a clear message that wealth and power do not place anyone above the law. Justice demands that we protect the most vulnerable members of our society from those who would exploit them. After deliberating for 2 days, the jury returned with their verdict. The foreman, an elderly man who had listened intently throughout the trial, stood to read the decision. "On the charge of conspiracy to commit medical assault, we find the defendant guilty. On the charge of medical fraud, we find the defendant guilty. On the charge of violation of informed consent, we find the defendant guilty. On the charge of endangering the welfare of minors, we find the defendant guilty." The courtroom erupted. Amara felt her knees give out as the reality hit her. They had won. After months of fighting, of being threatened and harassed, of facing down one of the most powerful men in Nigeria, they had actually won. Kahinde's face remained impassive. As Justice Ogundimu sentenced him to 15 years in prison and ordered him to pay N2, 5 billion in damages to be split among the Genesis 7 and the other victims who had been identified across West Africa. His business assets were to be liquidated to establish a fund for ongoing medical care for affected children and psychological treatment for all victims. But the legal victory was only the beginning of Amara's transformation. 3 months after the trial concluded, as Amara was finally beginning to adjust to life as a new mother while resuming her medical studies, she received an unexpected visitor. Kahinde's sister, Folashade Ogbonna Williams, arrived at her family's apartment on a sweltering Lagos afternoon. Folashade was nothing like her brother. Where Kahinde was calculating and controlled, she was warm and direct. A successful pediatric surgeon who had publicly denounced her brother's actions during the trial, she had come with an offer that would change everything. "My brother is a broken man," she said, sitting in the small living room while Amara's 3-month-old daughter slept peacefully in her arms. "What he did was unforgivable. But I've been working with the court-appointed administrators of his assets, and I want to propose something." Amara listened warily as Folashade outlined her plan. Instead of simply liquidating Kahinde's assets for victim compensation, she proposed using his business infrastructure and connections to create something unprecedented, a network of free fertility clinics across Africa that would operate under the strictest ethical guidelines, providing hope for infertile couples while maintaining absolute transparency and consent protocols. We could help thousands of families who are facing the same desperation my brother felt, but we would do it the right way, with full disclosure, proper consent, and genuine care for every patient. "Why are you telling me this?" Amara asked. "Why not work with established medical organizations?" "Because you understand both sides of this story. You know the desperation that drives people to make dangerous choices, and you know the consequences of medical procedures conducted without proper safeguards. You have the medical training to ensure ethical practices, and you have the moral authority that comes from surviving what my brother put you through." The proposal was staggering in its scope. Folashade wanted Amara to become the chief medical ethics officer of what would become the largest fertility treatment network in Africa. She would have final authority over all treatment protocols, consent procedures, and patient care standards. The Genesis 7 would form the Patient Advocacy Board, ensuring that the voices of those who had been harmed would guide every decision. "I need time to think," Amara said, "and I need to discuss this with the others." The Genesis 7 met once again, this time in Amara's family home. As they sat in a circle, their children playing around them, Ololaide babbling happily while Emeka worked with his physical therapist, they grappled with an impossible decision. "It feels wrong to benefit from what happened to us," Bukola said quietly. She had recovered significantly from her initial trauma, but still struggled with trust issues, like we're being rewarded for being victims. "But think about how many women we could help," Yemi argued. She had returned to teaching and had become an outspoken advocate for medical ethics reform. How many families facing infertility could have hope without being exploited? Hawa, now 20 and studying law herself, saw the broader implications. "This isn't about benefiting from our trauma. This is about transforming it into something that prevents others from experiencing what we did." Aduni held Emeka as he struggled to focus on a colorful toy, his developmental delays evident, but his determination inspiring. "My son will never have a normal life because of what Kehinde did to me, but maybe we can make sure no other child suffers because their parents made desperate choices." Folake, whose medical career had been derailed, but who had found new purpose as a patient advocate, was pragmatic. "We have a choice. We can let what happened to us remain a tragedy, or we can turn it into the foundation for helping others. The question is, are we strong enough to do the work?" Amara looked around at these extraordinary women who had become her sisters through shared trauma and mutual support. Each had been broken by what happened to them, but each had also found ways to rebuild themselves into something stronger. "If we do this," she said slowly, "it can't just be about running fertility clinics. We need to create a new model for medical ethics in Africa. We need to train doctors and nurses in proper consent procedures. We need to advocate for legal reforms that protect patients. We need to support other women who've been harmed by medical exploitation." "A movement," Yemi said, understanding immediately. "We're talking about starting a movement. The Genesis movement," Hawa suggested, "because Genesis means beginning. And maybe that's what this is. Not the end of our story, but the beginning of something bigger." 2 years later, the Genesis Fertility Network had opened 12 clinics across Nigeria, Ghana, Kenya, and South Africa. Each clinic operated under revolutionary ethical guidelines developed by Amara and her team. Every patient received comprehensive counseling, detailed explanations of all procedures in their native language, and multiple opportunities to withdraw consent without penalty. The Genesis 7 had become the Genesis Board, overseeing not just fertility treatments, but a comprehensive support network for women's reproductive health across Africa. They had successfully lobbied for legislative reforms in 6 countries, strengthening patient protection laws and establishing criminal penalties for medical exploitation. Amara had completed her medical degree with highest honors, specializing in reproductive medicine and medical ethics. Her thesis on informed consent in fertility treatments had been translated into 12 languages and was required reading in medical schools across 3 continents. But the most remarkable transformation had been in Kehinde himself. It started with a single letter, delivered to Amara's office at the main Genesis clinic in Lagos. The return address showed it had come from Kirikiri Maximum Security Prison, where Kahinda was serving his sentence. "Dear Dr. Amara," it began, "I know I have no right to write to you, no right to ask for your attention after what I took from you, but I wanted you to know that I have been following the work of the Genesis Network, and I am both amazed and humbled by what you have accomplished. I spend most of my days in a 6L8 cell, thinking about the choices I made and the lives I destroyed. I have been attending prison counseling sessions, trying to understand how my desperation blinded me to the humanity of the women I harmed. It is painful work, but necessary. I wanted you to know that I have signed over the last of my personal assets to the Genesis Foundation. It's not enough. It will never be enough to undo what I did. But perhaps it can help a few more families receive the ethical fertility care they deserve. I don't ask for forgiveness. I don't deserve it. But I wanted you to know that your strength in transforming tragedy into hope has changed me in ways I am still discovering." Amara read the letter 3 times before showing it to her mother, who had become her closest advisor and the grandmother figure to all the Genesis 7 children. "What do you think?" Amara asked. Her mother considered carefully. "I think a man who has truly changed doesn't ask for forgiveness. He simply tries to live differently. The question is, do you believe he has changed, or is this another manipulation?" More letters followed, each one documenting Kahinda's journey through therapy, his growing understanding of trauma and consent, his work teaching literacy to fellow inmates. He never asked for anything, not forgiveness, not reduced sentences, not personal meetings. He simply shared his process of recognizing and confronting what he had done. After 6 months of letters, Amara made a decision that surprised everyone, including herself. She decided to visit him in prison. The visiting room at Kirikiri Prison was stark and oppressive, filled with the tension of families separated by crime and consequence. When Kahinda was led in, Amara was shocked by the transformation. Gone was the polished billionaire she had known. The man who sat across from her was thinner, grayer, marked by the weight of genuine remorse. "Thank you for coming," he said quietly. "I wasn't sure you would." "I wasn't sure I would either," Amara replied honestly. "But I needed to see for myself whether your letters were genuine or just another form of manipulation." They sat in silence for several minutes, the weight of their shared history hanging between them. Finally, Kahinda spoke. "I've had 3 years to think about what I did to you, to all of you. 3 years to understand that my desperation doesn't excuse the violation, the lies, the harm I caused. I know that saying I'm sorry is meaningless after what I took from you. Then why did you want to see me?" Amara asked. "Because I wanted you to know that watching what you've built with the Genesis Network has shown me what real strength looks like. You took the worst thing that ever happened to you and turned it into hope for thousands of other people. You didn't let what I did define you or limit you or make you smaller. You became larger than the trauma." Amara studied his face, searching for signs of manipulation or false emotion, but what she saw was something she hadn't expected. Genuine transformation. "The man who hurt me was driven by desperation and entitlement," she said slowly. "He believed his pain justified violating other people's bodies and choices. Are you still that man?" "No," Kahinda replied without hesitation. "That man died in this prison cell slowly and painfully, as he was forced to confront what his choices had cost. I can't undo what I did. I can't give back what I took. But I can spend the rest of my life trying to become worthy of the mercy you've shown by transforming my crimes into healing for others." That prison visit marked a turning point for Amara, not forgiveness. That would take much longer and might never come fully, but the beginning of understanding that healing didn't require her to carry hatred forever. She began incorporating restorative justice principles into the Genesis Network's work, bringing together survivors of medical exploitation with reformed healthcare workers who had violated ethical guidelines. The sessions were painful but transformative, creating a new model for addressing medical trauma that focused on healing rather than purely punitive measures. Kahinda continued his letters, but they evolved from reports of his personal growth to practical suggestions for the Genesis Network based on his business experience. His insights into healthcare infrastructure, funding models and organizational management proved valuable, though every suggestion was carefully vetted by the Genesis board before implementation. Most remarkably, he began corresponding with the other members of the Genesis Seven. Folak initially refused to engage, but eventually began a guarded exchange focused on medical ethics education. Bukola, who had developed severe trust issues, found unexpected healing in confronting her anger directly through written dialogue with the man who had harmed her. The breakthrough came when Aduni decided to tell Kahinda about Emeka's daily struggles with his developmental delays. Her letter was raw and painful, describing the challenges of caring for a special needs child while pursuing her own education and career goals. Kahinda's response changed everything. "Dear Aduni," his letter began, "reading about Emeka's struggles broke something open in me that I didn't even know was still intact. I want you to know that I don't consider myself his father. I have no right to that title. But I am the man whose actions caused his disabilities, and I need to take responsibility for that in more than just financial terms. I have been researching developmental disabilities and the specific complications that can arise from experimental fertility procedures. I have contacted specialists around the world who might be able to help Emeka. I know that money can't fix everything, but if there are treatments, therapies, or interventions that could improve his quality of life, I want to ensure he has access to them. I also want you to know that I have established a trust fund specifically for Emeka's care that will provide for him throughout his entire life, regardless of what happens to me or my other assets. He will never want for medical care, educational support, or personal assistance. But more than that, I want you to know that I think about him every day, not as my biological child, but as an innocent person whose life was affected by my choices. I carry the weight of his struggles, and I will for the rest of my life." The letter continued with detailed information about cutting-edge treatments for developmental delays, specialists who had agreed to consult on Emeka's case, and research programs that might benefit him. It was clear that Kahinda had spent enormous amounts of time and energy advocating for a child he would likely never meet. Aduni shared the letter with the other Genesis 7 members, and for the first time since the ordeal began, they found themselves grappling with a complex question. What do you do when the person who harmed you begins to show genuine care for the consequences of that harm? As the Genesis network expanded into its 5th year of operation, the children born from the experimental procedures, Ololade, Emeka, and 3 others whose mothers had been located in other countries, were growing into remarkable individuals, despite their challenging beginnings. Ololade, now 5 years old, was brilliant and curious, showing aptitude for both science and art. She had no memory of the controversy surrounding her birth, knowing only that she was deeply loved by her mother and grandmother. Amara had chosen to tell her age-appropriate versions of her origin story, emphasizing that sometimes good things can come from difficult circumstances. Emeka had made significant progress with intensive therapy and the specialized treatments arranged through Kahinda's contacts. While he would always face challenges, he was walking, communicating through sign language and showing a remarkable ability to connect with other children despite his developmental delays. The Genesis board faced a difficult decision: what to tell these children about their unique origins as they grew older. How do you explain to a child that they exist because of a crime, but that their existence has also led to healing and hope for thousands of others? Amara brought the question to one of her regular meetings with Dr. Folashade, who had become not just a colleague, but a close friend and mentor. They sat in the garden of the main Genesis clinic, watching children play in the family area while their parents received counseling or treatment. "I think," Folashade said carefully, "that these children deserve to know the truth about their origins when they're old enough to understand it. But more importantly, they deserve to know the truth about what their mothers accomplished in response to that injustice." "You think they should know about Kahinda?" Amara asked. "I think they should know that they have a biological father who made terrible choices that harmed their mothers, but who has spent years trying to make amends for those choices. Whether they choose to have any relationship with him when they're adults should be entirely up to them." It was a conversation they would have many times over the coming years, but it established a principle that would guide their approach: radical honesty tempered with age-appropriate timing and unconditional support for whatever choices the children made about their complex heritage. By its 7th year, the Genesis Network had become a global movement. The organization operated fertility clinics in 12 countries, had influenced medical ethics legislation in over 20 nations and had trained thousands of healthcare workers in proper consent procedures and trauma-informed care. Amara had been invited to speak at the World Health Organization, had testified before the International Criminal Court about medical exploitation as a form of gender-based violence, and had been awarded the African Union's highest honor for human rights advocacy. But perhaps more importantly, the Genesis 7 had demonstrated that survivors of systematic harm could transform their trauma into institutional change. Their model was being replicated by other survivor advocacy groups around the world, creating a new paradigm for justice that emphasized healing and prevention alongside accountability. The most recent addition to their work was the Genesis Justice Project, which provided legal support and advocacy for victims of medical exploitation worldwide. Working with international law firms and human rights organizations, they had successfully prosecuted 17 cases of fertility fraud across 4 continents. In the 10th year after the original trial, Amara received a request that no one could have anticipated. Kehinde, now 52, and having served 7 years of his sentence, was eligible for parole consideration. His lawyers weren't requesting early release. They were asking the Genesis Board to provide victim impact statements for his parole hearing. The request divided the Genesis 7 for the first time since they had formed their alliance. Some felt that Kehinde had served enough time and demonstrated genuine rehabilitation. Others believed that early release would diminish the severity of his crimes and the ongoing impact on survivors. The debate was passionate but respectful, conducted over several months through video calls, in-person meetings, and extensive written exchanges. Each woman grappled with questions of justice, forgiveness, rehabilitation, and the message that early release might send to other potential perpetrators. Ultimately, they reached a consensus that surprised even themselves. They would not oppose his parole, but they would request that any early release include specific conditions. Kehinde would be required to continue his correspondence with survivors who chose to maintain that connection, would provide ongoing financial support for victim services and the Genesis network, and would be prohibited from any involvement in fertility treatment or medical research for the remainder of his life. Most importantly, they requested that he be required to speak publicly about his crimes and their impact, serving as a living example of the consequences of medical exploitation and the possibility of genuine rehabilitation. The parole hearing drew international media attention, with journalists and advocates filling the courtroom to witness this unprecedented case of restorative justice in action. Amara, now 39 and an internationally recognized expert in medical ethics, spoke on behalf of the Genesis 7. "Your Honor," she began, her voice steady and confident. 10 years ago, Kehinde Ogbonna stole something from 7 young women that can never be returned. Our reproductive autonomy, our trust in medical institutions, and our sense of safety in our own bodies. The man who committed those crimes was driven by desperation and entitlement, believing that his pain justified violating our fundamental human rights. The man who sits before you today has spent a decade confronting the reality of what he did, supporting his victims, and working to prevent others from following his path. This transformation doesn't erase his crimes or minimize their impact, but it does demonstrate something important about the possibility of genuine rehabilitation. The Genesis 7 do not oppose his parole because we believe that justice is not solely about punishment. It is about accountability, healing, and prevention. Kehinde has been accountable for his actions. He has contributed to our healing and the healing of thousands of others, and he has become a powerful voice for prevention. We believe that his voice can do more good speaking publicly about the consequences of medical exploitation than it can serve sitting silently in a prison cell. Kehinde was granted parole with the conditions the Genesis 7 had requested. His first public appearance was at a medical ethics conference in Geneva, where he spoke about the corruption of desperate desire and the importance of informed consent. The speech was raw, painful, and powerful, a former perpetrator speaking truth about the devastating impact of his crimes. 2 years after Kehinde's release, Amara faced another life-changing decision. Dr. Chiwetel Okoro, a brilliant trauma surgeon who had joined the Genesis network as Director of Mental Health Services, had been courting her for over a year. Their relationship had developed slowly, built on mutual respect, shared values, and Chiwetel's deep understanding of trauma recovery. The proposal came during a quiet evening at Amara's home, with 8-year-old Olalade playing nearby, and Amara's mother offering gentle encouragement from the kitchen. Chiwetel didn't ask for an immediate answer. He understood that for someone whose reproductive choices had once been stolen, the decision to marry and potentially have more children needed to be made entirely on her own terms. Amara took 3 months to decide, consulting with the other Genesis 7 members, discussing the implications with her therapist, and most importantly, talking extensively with Olalade about what it would mean to have a stepfather. Her daughter's response was characteristically direct. "Will he be kind to you, Mama? Will he make you smile more than you cry?" "Yes, sweetheart. I believe he will." "Then you should marry him. But tell him that if he ever makes you sad, I will be very angry with him." The wedding was a celebration of healing and hope, attended by the extended Genesis family, colleagues from around the world, and hundreds of women whose lives had been touched by the network's work. Kehinde was not invited. That boundary remained firmly in place. But he sent a letter expressing his happiness for Amara's new beginning and his gratitude for her role in his own transformation. The ceremony itself was a fusion of traditional Nigerian customs and modern innovations, including vows that emphasized mutual consent, shared decision-making, and respect for individual autonomy. Amara's wedding dress was designed by Bukola, who had discovered a talent for fashion design during her recovery and now ran a successful boutique in Abuja. 5 years into her marriage, Amara gave birth to twins, a boy and a girl she named Kioma and Kelechi. The pregnancy was carefully planned and monitored, with Amara insisting on comprehensive informed consent for every medical procedure, despite her extensive medical knowledge. The birth of her chosen children felt like a completion of her healing journey. Where Olalade's conception had been stolen from her, Chioma and Kelechi were the result of conscious choice, mutual love, and complete autonomy over her reproductive decisions. Olalade, now 13 and remarkably mature for her age, embraced her role as big sister with enthusiasm and protectiveness. She had finally learned the full story of her origin, not just the violation that led to her conception, but the extraordinary strength her mother had shown in transforming that trauma into healing for others. "I understand now why people are interested in our family," she told Amara one evening as they prepared dinner together. "It's not just because of what happened to you. It's because of what you did with what happened." "And what do you think about that?" Amara asked, always careful to gauge her daughter's feelings about their unique situation. "I think I'm proud to be your daughter, and I think I want to be a doctor too so I can help people like you do." In the 15th year after the original trial, the Genesis Network had become one of the most respected reproductive health organizations in the world. They operated facilities in 28 countries, had trained over 50,000 healthcare workers in ethical practice standards, and had successfully advocated for comprehensive patient protection laws in 43 nations. The organization's annual conference had become the premier gathering for reproductive rights advocates, medical ethicists, and fertility specialists worldwide. This year's theme was From Trauma to Transformation, Building Ethical Healthcare Systems. Amara, now recognized as one of the leading voices in global reproductive rights, delivered the keynote address to an audience of over 3,000 attendees. Her speech traced the journey from that moment 15 years earlier, when she stared at a pregnancy test in disbelief, to the global movement she now led. "Trauma," she said, "is not a choice. Trauma," she said, "is not a choice. But what we do with trauma is always a choice. We can let it define us, limit us, make us smaller than we were before. Or we can use it as raw material to build something larger than ourselves, something that ensures others don't have to suffer as we did." The Genesis 7 made a choice 15 years ago to transform our violation into advocacy, our pain into purpose, our trauma into healing for others. That choice didn't erase what happened to us, but it ensured that what happened to us would serve something greater than our individual suffering. Every woman who receives truly informed consent before a medical procedure, every couple who receives ethical fertility treatment, every victim of medical exploitation who finds support and justice, They are all living proof that trauma can be transformed into healing when survivors choose to fight not just for themselves, but for others who will come after them. The speech received a standing ovation that lasted over 10 minutes, but Amara's attention was focused on the front row, where the other Genesis 7 members sat with their families. Folktale had become a leading patient advocate and was now training the next generation of ethical healthcare workers. Bukola had built a successful fashion empire while using her platform to speak about consent and body autonomy. Yemi had returned to teaching and had authored several children's books about making safe choices. Hawa had become a prominent human rights lawyer, specializing in medical exploitation cases. She had successfully prosecuted dozens of similar crimes across Africa and had been instrumental in establishing the International Protocol on Medical Consent. Adoni had completed her nursing degree and now worked as the Director of Special Needs Services for the Genesis Network, ensuring that children like Emeka received the specialized care they needed. And Emeka himself, now 18 years old, had defied every prediction about his developmental limitations. Though he would always face challenges, he had learned to communicate effectively, had developed remarkable artistic abilities, and had become a powerful advocate for the rights of people with disabilities. His graduation from secondary school had been one of the most celebrated moments in Genesis Network history. The most surprising development came in the form of a letter Ololaide received on her 18th birthday. It was from Kahinda, now 63, and living quietly in a small town outside Lagos where he worked as a volunteer counselor for people struggling with addiction and desperate decision-making. Dear Ololaide, the letter began. Today you become an adult, and I wanted you to know that I have thought about you every single day since you were born. I know I have no right to contact you directly, and I will completely understand if you choose not to respond to this letter. I am your biological father, but I am not your dad. Your mother raised you with strength, wisdom, and love that I could never have provided. She turned the worst mistake of my life into the best parts of who you have become. I wanted you to know that I am proud of the young woman you have grown into, even though I played no role in shaping your character. Your intelligence, your compassion, your commitment to justice, these are gifts from your mother and your grandmother, not from me. I also wanted you to know that if you ever choose to meet me, I would be honored. But if you choose not to, I will respect that decision completely. My role in your life was never supposed to be about what I wanted. It was supposed to be about what was best for you. You owe me nothing. But you have given me something precious by simply existing in the world and becoming the remarkable person you are today. Ololaide showed the letter to her mother, stepfather, and grandmother, asking for their guidance about how to respond. After much discussion and consultation with her therapist, she made her own choice. She wrote back. The correspondence that followed was careful, boundaried, and entirely under Ololaide's control. She asked hard questions about his crimes, his motivations, and his transformation. She shared carefully selected details about her life, her goals, and her values. She made it clear that any relationship between them would be on her terms and could be ended at any time. After 6 months of letters, she decided to meet him. The meeting took place at the Genesis Clinic in Lagos, with Amara present and a therapist facilitating the conversation. Kahinda was visibly nervous, having spent weeks preparing for a meeting that might never happen again. Ololaide was direct, as she had always been. I need you to understand that I don't need a father. I have a stepfather who loves me, and a mother who has been everything I needed. This meeting isn't about filling a void in my life. I understand, Kahinda replied. I'm grateful you chose to meet me at all. I'm here because I needed to see who you are now, not who you were when you hurt my mother. I needed to understand if the man who wrote those letters is real or just another manipulation. They talked for 2 hours about responsibility, redemption, and the ongoing impact of past choices. Ololaide asked about his work with addiction recovery, his understanding of consent and trauma, and his ongoing relationship with the other Genesis 7 members. At the end of the meeting, she made her decision about future contact. I'm willing to continue writing to you, she said, but I need you to understand that this isn't forgiveness, and it's not absolution. This is me choosing to have a relationship with the person you've become while never forgetting the harm you caused to create me. Now, 20 years after that first pregnancy test in a cramped bathroom in Lagos, Amara stands at the podium of the United Nations General Assembly, addressing world leaders about the global crisis of medical exploitation and the revolutionary approaches her organization has developed to combat it. The Genesis Network now operates in 57 countries. The Genesis 7 have become the Genesis Foundation Board, overseeing not just fertility services, but comprehensive women's health advocacy, medical ethics education, and survivor support services worldwide. Their work has influenced international law, transformed medical education, and provided healing for over 100,000 survivors of medical exploitation. Amara's 3 children represent different aspects of her journey. Ololade, now 23 and completing her medical residency in reproductive medicine, embodies the strength that can emerge from trauma transformed into purpose. Chioma and Kelechi, now 8 years old, represent the joy of conscious choices and the family Amara built on her own terms. But perhaps the most remarkable legacy is the model of restorative justice that emerged from their story. The careful, boundaried relationship between Kehinde and the families affected by his crimes has been studied by criminologists, theologians, and justice advocates around the world as an example of how healing can coexist with accountability. Kehinde, now 73, continues his work in addiction recovery and speaks regularly about the dangers of desperate decision-making and the importance of informed consent. His relationship with Ololade has evolved into a careful friendship built on mutual respect and clear boundaries. He has never met his other biological children from the experimental procedures, respecting their families' choices about contact. Most importantly, he has never stopped supporting the Genesis Network's work, both financially and through his unique perspective as a former perpetrator who has done the hard work of genuine rehabilitation. The story's final twist comes not from external drama, but from internal transformation. On the 20th anniversary of the Genesis Network's founding, Amara makes an announcement that surprises even her closest colleagues. She is stepping down as director to focus on a new project, establishing the first university in Africa dedicated entirely to reproductive rights, medical ethics, and trauma-informed healthcare. The University of Genesis will train the next generation of healthcare workers in practices that prioritize patient autonomy, informed consent, and healing-centered care. 20 years ago, she tells the gathered crowd of survivors, advocates, and supporters, 7 young women made a choice to transform their trauma into healing for others. Today, I am making a choice to ensure that transformation continues long after we are gone. This university will train doctors, nurses, counselors, and advocates who understand that medicine without ethics is just sophisticated harm. Students will learn not just how to treat medical conditions, but how to honor the full humanity of every person they serve. And at the heart of every classroom, every clinical rotation, every research project, will be the voices of survivors, reminding future healthcare workers that behind every patient is a person whose choices, dignity, and autonomy must be protected at all costs. The announcement is met with thunderous applause, but Amara's attention is focused on her family in the front row. Her mother, now in her 70s but still sharp and loving. Her husband Chiwetel, whose steady support has been the foundation of her chosen family. Her 3 children, each representing a different facet of her journey from victim to survivor to global advocate. And in the back of the room she notices Kehinde sitting quietly with the other supporters, his presence no longer a source of trauma, but simply one element in the complex tapestry of healing and accountability that has defined the last 2 decades. As she looks out at the crowd of faces, survivors and supporters, students and colleagues, families whose lives have been touched by the Genesis Network's work, Amara reflects on the impossible journey that brought them all together. The virgin girl who accidentally got pregnant for the billionaire had become the woman who transformed medical exploitation into global healing. The trauma that once threatened to destroy her had become the foundation for protecting countless others from similar harm. And the child born from violation had grown into a young woman committed to ensuring that reproductive choices remain exactly that. Choices made with full knowledge, complete autonomy, and absolute respect for the person making them. The ending wasn't the fairy tale resolution of trauma magically erased or perfect justice achieved. Instead, it was something more complex and more real, the ongoing work of healing, the daily choice to transform pain into purpose, and the recognition that some of life's most meaningful victories come not from avoiding suffering, but from refusing to let suffering have the final word. 20 years later, the story continues. Not because the trauma was forgotten or the justice was incomplete, but because the decision to choose healing over hatred, growth over revenge, and hope over despair had created something larger than any individual story of harm or recovery. In the end, that choice, made first by 7 scared young women in a hotel room in Abuja, and renewed every day since, had changed not just their own lives, but the lives of thousands of others who would benefit from the institutions, laws and cultural changes their courage had created. And perhaps that was the greatest victory of all, the transformation of personal trauma into lasting protection for others, ensuring that no other young woman would ever have to stare at a pregnancy test in confusion and fear, wondering how her life had been changed without her consent. The Virgin Girl's story had become everyone's story, a testament to the power of survivors to not just heal from harm, but to prevent that harm from happening to others.